The glass shattered in a deafening spray of crystal, just inches from Murray's head. 3 years. 3 years of meticulous loyalty, of climbing the jagged corporate ladder of soul, and of keeping her head down while the men above her lined their pockets. 3 years of being the perfect strategist, only to find out she was actually the perfect scapegoat. It had been exactly 4 hours since she hit send on the whistleblowing files, and only 40 minutes since the first black sedan had tried to run her off the rain-slicked streets of Gangnam. And now they were here, at Club Elysium, the most exclusive underground lounge in the city. Through the hazy, neon-blue smoke of the VIP section, she saw the leader of the cleaners step through the entrance. He wore a sharp, charcoal suit and that familiar, soulless expression she had seen in boardrooms, a look she now recognized as a death warrant. Murray felt the oxygen vanish from her lungs when his eyes locked onto hers through the crowd. He didn't rush. He simply nodded to the 2 men behind him and began to weave through the velvetrope tables. Every heavy step of his boots felt like a hammer striking the floorboards beneath her feet. She knew that cold, predatory gait. She knew the way he reached into his jacket to check his silencer. He was coming to erase her, to remind her that in this city, the truth didn't set you free. It got you buried in the foundations of a new skyscraper. Hello, I'm Afro under Boss Dynasty, and this is a fictional narration created for entertainment. If you're gripped by this story, subscribe to the channel so you never miss a chapter. Leave a like and tell me in the comments, what would you do if you were cornered? Panic surged through Murray like an electric shock. She couldn't let him reach the table, couldn't let the last thing she heard be the hollow click of a trigger. Her eyes swept the opulent room desperately, looking for a shadow to hide in, a back door, a miracle. Then, her gaze landed on the man sitting in the center of the darkness, Seo Joon-tae. He sat with a terrifying, regal stillness, a man so dangerous that even the cleaners wouldn't dare fire a shot in his direction. She didn't need an exit. She needed a shield. Murray didn't give herself time to hesitate. If she breathed, she would shatter. If she thought, she would run, and running was exactly what would get her killed. She moved with the desperate, jagged grace of a woman stepping off a ledge, her hand reaching out to steady herself on the shoulder of the man in the center of the booth. His suit jacket was cool, expensive silk, but the man beneath it felt like solid iron. Seo Joon-tae didn't move. He didn't flinch as she invaded his space, nor did he lean away as she pressed her lips to his. For a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, the ambient roar of Club Elysium, the bass, the clinking glass, the muffled laughter, ceased to exist. There was only the scent of his cologne, something like cedarwood and cold rain, and the terrifying stillness of his body. Across the room, the cleaners came to a dead halt. Murray didn't have to look at them to know the color had drained from their faces. In the hierarchy of Soul's shadows, there were predators, and then there was the man whose table she had just violated. To touch Seo Joon-tae without permission was a death sentence. To be his woman was to be untouchable. The men from her firm exchanged a frantic, terrified glance. The leader's hand, which had been reaching into his blazer, dropped as if the fabric had turned to white-hot lead. They didn't linger. Within seconds, they were retreating toward the neon-lit exit, disappearing into the crowd like ghosts fleeing the sunrise. Murray's lungs finally burned for air. She pulled back slowly, her heart drumming a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. Her hand lingered on his shoulder for a second too long, her fingers trembling as she prepared to whisper a breathless thank you and vanish before he could react. I'm so sorry, she breathed, her voice a fragile thread. I just needed. She started to stand, to put distance between herself and the black hole of his presence, but she didn't get far. A hand, large and gloved in midnight leather, moved with the speed of a striking viper. It clamped firmly around her waist, anchoring her to the leather seat beside him. The grip wasn't violent, but it was absolute, a silent, physical manifestation of ownership that made the air in her chest turn to ice. Murray looked up, finally meeting his eyes. They weren't angry. They were worse. They were focused, dark, and entirely unreadable, watching her with the analytical intensity of a scientist observing a specimen that had just done something fascinating. You should have looked at the exit signs before you chose your shield, Ms. Kang, Joon-tae said, his voice a low, melodic baritone that vibrated through her spine. He didn't let go. Instead, he leaned in, his breath grazing her ear. "In this room, you don't use me to escape. You only use me to enter a different kind of cage." The transition from the neon-pulsing chaos of Club Elysium to the interior of the black sedan was as swift and silent as a blade. Murray sat pressed against the window, the cold leather of the seat seeping through her blazer. Beside her, Seo Junti remained a shadow, his presence filling the cabin with a weight that made the high-end suspension feel heavy. Outside, the rain-slicked streets of Gangnam blurred into streaks of white and red, the city's lights reflecting off the darkened glass like distant fire. They bypassed the street-level entrances of the Lot World Tower, sweeping into a private underground bay where 3 men in identical charcoal suits stood at attention. Not a word was exchanged as the elevator ascended, the pressure in Murray's ears mounting along with her anxiety. When the doors finally slid open, she was met with a sprawling penthouse of glass and obsidian, overlooking a city that looked like a motherboard of shimmering circuitry. Junti stepped out first, unbuttoning his blazer with a rhythmic, measured grace. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He didn't have to. The heavy silence of the penthouse was a wall in itself. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing toward a low-slung sofa that faced the panoramic view of the Han River. Murray remained standing, her hands clenched at her sides to hide the tremor that had moved from her fingers to her knees. "I'm grateful for the intervention, Mr. Seo, but I won't take up any more of your time. If you could just ensure my exit." "You've spent too much time in boardrooms, Ms. Kang," Junti interrupted, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous baritone that made the air in the room feel thin. He walked to a small bar, pouring 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal glass. He didn't offer her one. "You think you can negotiate the terms of a debt after you've already spent the currency?" He turned, the city lights silhouetting his sharp jawline. "In the streets you just left, a kiss is a triviality. But in my world, perception is the only thing that keeps the vultures at bay. By touching me, you didn't just borrow my protection, you spent my reputation to buy your life." He walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the polished stone floor until he stopped just inches away. The scent of cedarwood and cold rain returned, suffocating and intimate. He reached out, his gloved thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a touch that was almost clinical in its precision. "Nothing in my world is free," he whispered, his eyes dark and focused, locking her in place. "You've made me a participant in your little corporate tragedy, and since you've used my name to silence your enemies, I've decided to keep you close until I determine exactly how much that silence is worth." Murray swallowed hard, her pulse jumping beneath his touch. The cleaners were gone, but as she looked into Junti's unreadable eyes, she realized the night hadn't ended. The trap had simply changed shape. The serenity of the Seo estate was an illusion, a fragile veneer of manicured gardens and silent waterfalls that felt more like a fortress than a home. Murray stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the secondary study, her reflection ghost-like against the backdrop of the darkened forest. She had spent the last 6 hours in a state of hypervigilance, waiting for the other shoe to drop, her corporate instincts telling her that the cleaners wouldn't simply vanish because of a single kiss. Seo Junti sat at an antique mahogany desk behind her, the glow of a tablet illuminating the sharp, unforgiving lines of his face. He hadn't spoken for 20 minutes, but the air between them was charged, a silent appraisal that felt like a weight on her shoulders. Suddenly, the calm was shattered by the low, rhythmic pulse of a red light on the desk's console. A muffled, synthesized voice crackled through a hidden speaker. "Security breach at the perimeter, Sector 4. Heat signature confirmed. They've bypassed the first layer, sir." Murray's breath hitched. She turned, her back pressing against the glass. "They're here." "They are persistent," Junti remarked, his voice devoid of alarm. He didn't stand. He didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he watched Murray. "The internal sensors picked up an incendiary device attached to the primary generator. We have roughly 3 minutes before the secondary gates lock and the power fails." The panic that had been simmering in Murray's gut flared into a cold, sharp fire. She looked at the door, then at Junti, who remained perfectly still. He wasn't just reporting a threat. He was conducting an experiment. He wanted to see if she would scream, if she would beg, or if the woman who had the audacity to kiss a monster would freeze when the monster's world caught fire. "The generator is beneath the south terrace," Murray said, her voice trembling but remarkably clear. She remembered the blueprints she'd glimpsed on his screen earlier. "If they blow that, the electronic locks on this wing will fail. You aren't safe here." "I am never safe, Miss Kang," he replied, his eyes narrowing. "But you are currently the one with the target on your back. What is your move? Do you run for the trees and hope they don't see you, or do you stay in the room with the man who can make them disappear?" A distant, heavy thud vibrated through the floorboards, the sound of a controlled breach. Murray's pulse hammered against her defined jawline, her eyes darting to the background figure of a guard moving swiftly past the door. She didn't run. She walked toward the desk, her hand resting firmly on the mahogany, mirroring the way she had held his shoulder in the club. "I'm a strategist, Mr. CEO," she whispered, her eyes locking onto his with a focused alertness. "I don't run into a dark forest without a map. If you wanted a coward, you picked the wrong woman to kiss." Junti's unreadable expression shifted, a ghost of a predatory smile touching his lips. He pressed a button on the console, and the red pulse vanished. "Good, because the bomb was a simulation, but the men at the perimeter, they are very real. Let's see how you handle the next move." The real threat didn't arrive with the sound of gunfire, but with the heavy, pressurized silence that followed the security lockdown. The estate's emergency lights cast a cold, surgical blue glow across the study, turning Junti's sharp features into a mask of shadows. He hadn't moved from his seat, his gaze still fixed on Murray with an intensity that felt more dangerous than the men prowling his perimeter. "You speak of strategy as if it's a shield, Miss Kang," he said, his voice a low, smooth vibration in the quiet room. "But a shield only works if the person holding it has something to protect. At this moment, you are a liability to my peace." Murray didn't flinch. Her heart was still racing, but the panic had crystallized into a sharp, cold clarity. Her eyes moved from his face to the glowing tablet on the desk, the one he had been studying before the simulation began. It was a complex web of shell companies and offshore holdings, the circulatory system of the CO syndicate. To anyone else, it was a mess of data. To a woman who had spent years auditing the most corrupt firms in Seoul, it was a story. "You're being bled," she said, her voice dropping into the steady, clinical tone of the strategist she was. Junti's eyes narrowed, his stillness suddenly more predatory. "Careful, Murray." "Sector 7 of your logistics arm," she continued, stepping closer to the desk until she could see the heat map of his transactions. She pointed to a series of recurring microtransfers hidden beneath the guise of maritime insurance. "It's a ghost loop. Someone isn't just stealing from you. They're using your own infrastructure to fund the very cleaners who are currently outside your gates. You're paying for your own assassination." The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Junti looked at the screen, then back at her. The unreadable chill in his expression didn't vanish, but it shifted. He saw what she saw, the subtle, brilliant flaw that had escaped his own analysts for months. "The men outside are a distraction," Murray said, her hand resting firmly on the mahogany desk, her posture polished and controlled despite the sweat dampening the back of her neck. "They're meant to keep you looking at the fence while your foundation is eroded from the inside. You don't need a bodyguard, Mr. CEO. You need an architect who knows how the monsters build their houses." She met his gaze, refusing to be the first to blink. She was no longer just a woman who had kissed a stranger in a club. She was a woman offering him the keys to his own kingdom. "I can close the loop in 48 hours, she whispered, "but I don't work for free. And I don't work for a captor. I work for a partner." Junti stood up slowly, his towering height casting a long shadow over her. He reached out, his gloved fingers grazing the side of her neck, his thumb resting just beneath her jaw. It was a gesture of dominance, yet there was a new, terrifying respect in the pressure of his touch. "A partner," he mused, the words tasting like a threat and a promise. "The night was supposed to be a trap, Murray, but it seems you're trying to build a throne out of the wreckage." The following evening, the estate had settled into a heavy, artificial stillness. The breach at the perimeter had been handled, silently, efficiently, leaving the air tasting of ozone and expensive jasmine. Murray stood before a gilded mirror in the guest suite, her fingers moving with rhythmic, practiced precision as she redid her cornrow braids. The neat, straight lines pulled back from her face were a ritual of control, a way to settle the jagged edges of her mind after a night of looking into the abyss. She didn't hear the door open. She only felt the sudden shift in the room's pressure, the familiar, magnetic pull of Seo Junti's presence. He didn't approach her immediately. He stood by the arched doorway, his black blazer discarded, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled up to reveal forearms that looked as though they were carved from marble. He watched her in the mirror, his intense eyes fixed on the movement of her hands. Usually, his gaze was a weapon, a tool used to dismantle an opponent's resolve. But tonight, it was different. It was curious. "You don't shake," he remarked, his voice a low, melodic baritone that echoed softly against the high ceilings. Murray's hands didn't falter. She finished the braid, tucking the end with a sharp, decisive flick. "Shaking is for people who still think they have a choice, Mr. Seo. I haven't had a choice since I stepped into that club." She turned to face him, her features sharp and elegant under the soft amber glow of the chandelier. Her posture was polished, but the anxiety that usually tightened her shoulders had softened into something resembling exhaustion. For the first time, she wasn't looking at him as a shield or a captor, but as the only person in Seoul who knew the weight of the secrets she carried. Junti stepped into the room, his movements graceful and dominant. He stopped a hair's breadth away, his gaze sweeping over the intricate patterns of her hair before settling on her eyes. He saw the woman behind the whistleblower, the strategist who had been forced to become a survivor, the woman who had traded her perfect life for a dangerous truth. "The trap I set for you," he said, his voice dropping into a register that was almost intimate, "was meant to break your pride. I wanted to see how long it would take for the corporate shell to crack." He reached out, not to seize her jaw this time, but to let his gloved fingers ghost over the smoothness of her temple, tracing the line where the braids met her deep brown skin. The touch was light, almost a question. "But you don't crack," he whispered. "You adapt. You find the flaw in the cage and make it your home." Murray realized then that the walls of the estate no longer felt like a prison. The surveillance, the suited guards, the shadow of Junti, they were no longer the things hunting her. They were the things standing between her and the world that wanted her dead. In the silence of the room, the trap had begun to feel like the only sanctuary she had ever known. The air in the private backroom of the Seven Stars Casino was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the silent, vibrating tension of men who played with lives instead of chips. Murray stood just a step behind Junti's shoulder, her tailored black blazer a sharp contrast to the velvet shadows of the room. She was ostensibly there as his companion, the woman from the club, but her eyes, sharp and alert, were scanning the table with the surgical precision of a hunter. Across from them sat Director O, the very man who had signed the first execution order on her life. He looked comfortable. His fingers toyed with a stack of high-value chips as he laughed at a joke Junti hadn't bothered to acknowledge. O believed he was safe in this neutral territory, unaware that the whistleblower he had tried to bury was currently deconstructing his every move. Junti played with a cold, unreadable grace, his focus entirely on the cards. But every few seconds, Murray would lean in, her hand resting firmly on his shoulder in a gesture of forced intimacy that masked a deeper exchange. With a subtle tap of her finger against the fabric of his suit, she signaled the patterns she had memorized from the embezzlement files, the specific tells of a man who was used to hiding massive deficits. "The maritime insurance ghost loop," Murray whispered into Junti's ear, her lips grazing his skin as if she were sharing a secret endearment. "He's not just bluffing the hand, Mr. Seo. He's bluffing the buy-in. He used your own diverted funds to sit at this table tonight." Junti didn't flinch. He simply tossed a final, staggering pile of chips into the center. The room went deathly quiet. Director O's smile faltered, a bead of sweat breaking the polished facade of his brow. In that moment, the corporate strategist and the mafia boss operated as a single, lethal machine. Murray provided the data. Junti provided the blade. When O eventually folded, his face ashen as Junti revealed a hand that shouldn't have been possible, the trap finally snapped shut. The director looked up, his gaze landing on Murray for the first time with a dawning, horrific recognition. He went to speak, but the watchful, suited man in the background took a single step forward, and the words died in his throat. As they walked back through the darkened casino floor, Junti's pace was slower, his presence less like a cage and more like a fortress. He didn't look at her, but the way he adjusted his shirt cuffs, composed and dominant, felt different. "You didn't just find a leak," Junti said, his voice a low, melodic baritone that echoed in the private hallway. "You found the architect of the entire betrayal." He stopped, turning to face her. For the first time, the intensity in his eyes wasn't a threat. It was the realization that the woman he had intended to keep as a trophy was, in fact, the most powerful asset he had ever acquired. The kiss had been a gamble, but the partnership was the real jackpot. The black sedan tore through the rain-slicked arteries of Gangnam like a shadow fleeing the light. Behind them, the headlights of 3 SUVs pulsed with a rhythmic, predatory intent. A spray of gunfire shattered the rear window, the crystal shards raining down onto the leather upholstery like diamonds. Junti cursed, his hand going to his shoulder where a blooming crimson stain began to mar the pristine white of his shirt. "Junti." Murray's voice was sharp, a whip crack in the cramped, ozone-heavy cabin. "I'm fine," he gritted out, though his jaw was locked in a mask of pain. His grip on the steering wheel faltered as the car fishtailed across the slick asphalt. Murray didn't wait for permission. She moved with the fluid, desperate precision of a woman who had realized that calculated control was the only thing standing between them and the morgue. She climbed over the center console, her body pressing against his in a brief, heated friction that ignored the chaos outside. "Move, now." For a heartbeat, Junti looked at her, not as a strategist or a captive, but as a man seeing a fighter for the first time. He slid into the passenger seat, his blood staining the armrest as Murray gripped the wheel. Her cornrow braids were tight, her eyes focused on the neon blur of the city. She slammed the shifter into gear and floored it. The car roared, the engine's scream echoing against the skyscrapers. Murray didn't drive like a corporate employee. She drove like she was rewriting the rules of the road. She dived into narrow alleys, the side mirrors clipping trash cans in a spray of sparks, and executed a handbrake turn that sent the pursuing SUVs skidding into a fruit stall. Junti leaned back, his breath ragged, watching her. He watched the way her jaw never wavered, the way her deep brown skin glowed under the passing streetlights, and the sheer, unadulterated grit in her eyes. The adrenaline in the car was thick, a shared electric current that fused them together in the silence of the high-speed flight. The trap he had set for her on that first night had been built on power and debt. But as they drifted through a final, narrow corner and left the sirens behind in a blur of red and blue, the debt felt irrelevant. He realized then that he wasn't keeping her because of the kiss or the financial loop she had closed. He was keeping her because the woman behind the wheel was the only person who had ever made his heart beat for something other than survival. "You're a hell of a driver, Ms. Kang," he whispered, his voice a low, melodic vibration. Murray didn't look at him, her hands still firm on the wheel, but the corner of her lips quirked. "I told you, Mr. CEO, I'm a strategist. I always know the fastest way out." Junti looked out at the fading lights of the city and realized he didn't want her to find the way out. Not anymore. He wanted her right where she was, at his side, ruling the night. The Grand Hyatt's ballroom was a cathedral of gold leaf and treacherous intentions. Murray stood at the edge of the mezzanine, her tailored black blazer replaced by a gown of midnight silk that draped over her like armor. Her braids were pulled back with lethal precision, her high cheekbones catching the light of 1,000 chandeliers. Beside her, CEO Junti was a statue of unreadable calm, his hand resting on the small of her back, a gesture that no longer felt like a trap, but a pact. Below them, the board of directors celebrated their anniversary, oblivious to the fact that the woman they had tried to erase was holding the detonator to their empire. "The server is live," Murray whispered, her voice a low, steady vibration. "The moment I press enter, every major news outlet in Seoul receives the unredacted files, the embezzlement, the ghost loops, the signatures. There will be nowhere for them to hide. Junti's eyes swept the floor, pinpointing the cleaners stationed at the exits. They were disguised in waiters' jackets, but the bulge of their holsters gave them away to a man who lived in the shadows. And the moment the world sees the truth, they will stop trying to hide and start trying to kill. Are you ready, Murray? I've been ready since the night I kissed you, she replied, her eyes flashing with a cold, focused alertness. She pressed the key. On the massive digital screens behind the podium, the celebratory montage flickered and died, replaced by a scrolling ledger of corruption. The music cut out. A collective gasp rippled through the elite crowd as the names of the directors began to glow in crimson. Chaos erupted. The lead cleaner reached into his jacket, his eyes locked on Murray, but he never cleared his holster. Junti moved with a fluid, terrifying speed that defied his polished appearance. A single nod to the watchful, suited man in the background triggered a silent, surgical strike. Silenced shots thudded into the ornate pillars as Junti's men intercepted the assassins before they could take aim. Junti himself stepped in front of Murray, a human shield of iron and silk. He didn't flinch as a stray bullet shattered a champagne tower nearby. His focus was entirely on the man charging up the stairs, Director O. O's face was a mask of feral desperation, a silver revolver shaking in his hand. "You ruined everything," he shrieked. Junti didn't waste words. He disarmed the man in a blur of motion, the crack of bone echoing through the mezzanine. He didn't kill him, he simply dropped him at Murray's feet, broken and exposed. "The world is watching, O," Murray said, stepping forward, her voice amplified by the silence of the room. "And they don't like what they see." As the sirens began to wail in the distance, Junti turned to Murray. The predatory chill was still there, but beneath it was a fierce, protective pride. The cleaners were silenced, the board was fallen, and for the first time in her life, Murray wasn't a strategist for someone else's game. She was the one who had won. The morning sun broke over Seoul in a haze of pale gold, illuminating a city that was waking up to a transformed landscape. On every newsstand and digital billboard, the faces of the fallen board of directors were plastered alongside the headline of the largest corporate scandal in South Korean history. The cleaners had been dismantled, their shadow empire evaporated by the light of the truth Murray had unleashed. Murray stood on the private helipad atop the CO Syndicate's headquarters, the wind whipping her midnight silk gown against her legs. The air up here was thin and cold, tasting of freedom. Behind her, the rhythmic thrum of a waiting helicopter's blades cut through the silence. CO Junti stepped onto the concrete, his silhouette sharp against the rising sun. He had traded his tactical gear for a flawlessly tailored black suit, his presence once again radiating that calm, unreadable authority. He stopped a few feet from her, holding a single cream-colored envelope. "The dawn looks different when you aren't running from it, doesn't it?" he said, his voice a low, melodic baritone that settled deep in her chest. He held out the envelope. Inside was a one-way plane ticket to Geneva, a new identity, and enough offshore credits to ensure she would never have to work a day in her life again. "You've settled your debt, Murray," Junti said. His eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. "The loop is closed. The men who hunted you are in cells. You are free to go anywhere in the world. No traps, no cages." Murray looked down at the ticket, then out at the sprawling horizon of Seoul. For years, she had fought for a seat at the table, only to realize the table was rigged. She had spent her life trying to find a way out, believing that independence meant being alone. But as she looked at the city below, she realized she didn't see a prison anymore. She saw a kingdom that needed a new kind of architect. She looked back at Junti. The man who had turned a desperate night into a trap was now the only person who saw her as she truly was, not a whistleblower, not a victim, but an equal. The trap of his world hadn't broken her. It had tempered her into something unbreakable. It was the only place where her mind was valued as much as his steel. With a slow, deliberate motion, Murray tore the envelope in half. The wind caught the pieces, scattering them into the abyss of the city streets below. "I've spent enough time running, Mr. CO," she said, her voice polished and controlled, echoing with a new, terrifying power. And I think Geneva is far too quiet for a woman like me. Junti didn't smile, but the unreadable chill in his eyes thawed into something fierce and permanent. He stepped forward, his gloved hand coming to rest firmly on her shoulder, reclaiming the intimacy of their first night. But this time, there was no hesitation. "Then let's show them," he whispered. "What happens when the strategist and the boss finally stop playing games?" Murray turned away from the sky and toward the man beside her. She wasn't escaping anymore. She was staying to rule.